The Threshold Conclave at Meridon Spire was not a school in any sense a human would recognize, and the 7,000 candidates who arrived each cycle understood this within the first hour, when the lights came up cold and blue across the assessment floor and the proctoring intelligence began its work without a single word of welcome. It was a sorting engine, a vast vertical machine grown rather than built, its corridors lined with gray samite stone that absorbed sound and gave back only the faint hum of the grating lattice threaded through every wall. The conclave existed to measure, and what it measured it discarded. Of the 7,000 who entered, fewer than 90 would be marked fit for the diplomatic corps of the Cassine Reach, and the rest would be returned to their home systems, with their results inscribed permanently into their civic record, a number that would follow them for the remainder of their lives. The Reach did not believe in second attempts. It believed that a person revealed everything they were in the moment of pressure, and that pressure applied correctly would strip away pretense and leave only the true shape of a mind. This was the philosophy carved above the entrance arch in 300 languages, and beneath it, on the morning the new cycle began, a human stood reading the lowest inscription with the unhurried attention of a man checking a transit schedule. His name was Adam Reyes, and the registration lattice had assigned him Candidate Designation 7144, which placed him near the bottom of the arrival order, a position that the senior examiners noted and dismissed. He was not tall. Among the Cassine candidates, who averaged well over 2 meters and carried the pale luminous skin and faceted eyes of a species evolved beneath a dim red sun, he read as small, ordinary, almost negligible, a figure in a worn gray field jacket with the elbows gone soft from use. He did not look frightened, which the proctors logged as an anomaly of the first order, because nearly every candidate who arrived at the conclave arrived frightened, and the ones who did not were usually concealing it badly. Reyes concealed nothing. He simply did not appear to be afraid, in the way that a man who has worked a deep-pressure salvage rig is not afraid of a tall room. He registered, accepted his assessment band, and walked to his assigned alcove without speaking to anyone. And the only thing he did that the lattice flagged for review was that, on his way through the candidate hall, he stopped and crouched and pressed a fallen ventilation grill back into its housing, seating it with 2 fingers until the airflow steadied, before continuing on as though the act had cost him nothing and meant nothing. The woman who reviewed that flag was Senior Examiner Velt Koren, and she watched the recording twice before marking it inconclusive. Koren was the architect of the cycle's assessment sequence, a Cassine of 40 cycles standing, whose reputation rested on the cold elegance of her examinations and on the fact that no candidate she had ever passed had later failed in the field. She was respected in the way that a precise instrument is respected, without warmth, and she preferred it that way. Her authority over the cycle was total. The 8 examiners beneath her administered the tests she designed, and the proctoring intelligence enforced her standards. And the candidates moved through her sequence like ore through a refinery, and at the end she alone signed the list of the fit. She had signed it for 12 cycles. What no one beneath her knew, and what the conclave's oversight council had not yet thought to ask, was that for the last 3 of those cycles the list she signed had been quietly shaped by a second purpose, one that had nothing to do with measuring candidates, and everything to do with the contracts that flowed from the diplomatic placements and the families who paid for certain names to appear and certain names to vanish. Koren was not cruel. She had simply concluded, somewhere in the long gray middle of her career, that the machine she served was already corrupt at its foundations, and that a person who understood this was a fool not to profit from the understanding. She told herself this was clarity. It was the kind of clarity that requires no one ever look too closely at the results. The first assessment was the recall lattice, and Adam Reyes failed it completely. The recall lattice was designed to measure perfect retention under load. A candidate was seated before the lattice and shown a cascade of diplomatic precedents, treaty clauses, and protocol violations, 412 of them, presented at a rate that climbed steadily past the threshold of comfortable absorption, and at the end was required to reconstruct the sequence in exact order. The Cassine candidates, whose neural architecture had evolved for precisely this kind of layered memory, scored in the high 90s as a matter of course. Reyes scored 31. He reconstructed the early precedents flawlessly, then began around the 100th item to drop entries, and by the end he was reproducing only the structural shape of the sequence. The categories without the specifics, the architecture without the rooms. The proctoring intelligence logged a clean failure. Examiner Koren, reviewing the morning's results, marked candidate 7144 for early dismissal and moved on, and would have forgotten him entirely, except that a junior examiner named Tessuth, whose specialty was anomaly detection, and who had not yet learned to stop being curious, flagged something in the failure pattern that did not resolve. Tessuth was young by Cassine standards, barely 6 cycles into the core, and carried the particular discomfort of a mind that noticed things its superiors had decided were not worth noticing. He had a habit, much remarked upon and not admired, of returning to discarded data. What troubled him about the human's failure was not that it was a failure, but that it was an orderly one, a candidate whose memory genuinely collapsed under load-produced noise, dropped entries at random, garbled the early items as readily as the late ones. Reyes had not produced noise. He had dropped specifics while preserving structure with a consistency that looked, the more Tessuth examined it, less like a memory failing and more like a memory choosing. But Tessuth was junior, and his superior had already marked the candidate for dismissal, and so he did what junior examiners learn to do. He said nothing, and he kept the file. The second assessment was the pressure negotiation, and Reyes failed that one too. In the pressure negotiation, a candidate was placed in a sealed chamber across a table from a simulated counterpart, an adaptive construct trained on 10,000 hours of failed diplomatic encounters, and was given a scenario engineered to be unwinnable. The construct would offer a concession, then revoke it, then accuse the candidate of bad faith, then weep, then threaten, then fall silent, cycling through manipulations faster than a candidate could stabilize, and the measure was how long a candidate could hold a coherent line before the construct broke them into either capitulation or rage. The Cassine candidates trained for this their entire adolescence. The average hold time was 19 minutes. Reyes held for 4. At the 4-minute mark, when the construct accused him of having already decided the outcome and merely performing the negotiation, Reyes leaned back, looked at it for a moment, and said that it was right that he had decided, and that he did not see the point of pretending otherwise. Then he stopped talking. He sat in the chamber for the remaining 26 minutes of the allotted time in complete silence, hands folded, watching the construct cycle through every escalation in its repertoire, and he did not respond to any of it. The proctoring intelligence logged a failure for insufficient engagement. Corin marked it and moved on. Tessuth watched the recording 11 times. What Tessuth could not explain, and what he wrote in a private file he was not authorized to keep, was that the construct had broken first. The adaptive intelligence, designed to exhaust a candidate, had run through its escalation tree and reached the end of it. And at the end of it, facing a man who simply would not engage, it had begun to repeat itself, looping the same 3 manipulations with diminishing variation, until in the last minutes of the session, it had fallen into a degraded state the engineers called collapse, in which it produced only the null response. Reyes had not won the negotiation. He had refused to have it, and in refusing he had revealed the construct's limit, the precise point at which a machine built to break people ran out of ways to break, and he had done it not with cleverness but with stillness, the way a man waits out a storm by knowing it will end before he does. Tessuth had never seen a candidate produce collapse in the construct. He checked the archive. No candidate ever had. The third assessment was the crisis cascade, and here the cold logic of Corin's design began, though no one yet saw it, to turn its edge toward a darker purpose. The crisis cascade was a live exercise, conducted in the lower amphitheater, where the air was kept thin to simulate a failing environment, and candidates were grouped into provisional teams and given a deteriorating situation to manage, a cascading systems failure in a notional orbital habitat, with the measure being leadership, prioritization, and the willingness to make the hard allocation when resources ran short. Corin assigned the teams herself. She placed candidate 7144 in a team with 5 Cassine candidates whose families had no standing and no contracts, a team she had quietly designated for thinning because the cycle was running ahead of its placement quota, and the easiest way to bring the numbers into line was to construct a crisis cascade scenario that no team could survive intact and then grade the survivors. It was efficient. It had worked for 3 cycles. The candidates who died in the simulation died only in the record, but the failure followed them home all the same, and Corin had learned not to think about the homes. She had not accounted for the human noticing the air. The amphitheater's thin air protocol was generated by a bank of atmospheric regulators set into the floor. And 40 minutes into the crisis cascade, while his Cassine teammates argued over the allocation of notional coolant to a notional reactor, Reyes was on his knees at the edge of the team's assigned platform with his ear against the floor grill. The proctoring intelligence logged this as disengagement from the exercise. Tessuth, monitoring from the examiner's gallery, logged it as something else, because he had learned by now to watch the human rather than the scenario. Reyes was listening. He stayed there for almost 2 minutes, head tilted, one hand flat against the cold gray stone, and then he rose, walked to the team's atmospheric station, and shut down the third regulator in the bank, the one that had been running a quarter tone higher than the others. The one whose bearing had begun to sing the particular note that a deep pressure salvage worker learns to fear because it is the note a seal makes in the last hours before it fails. The amphitheater's air pressure, which had been engineered to drop steadily across the exercise to force the hard allocation, stabilized. The scenario's central pressure, robbed of the failing regulator that had been feeding its model, lost coherence. Corrin's unsurvivable crisis cascade became, abruptly, survivable. Corrin watched it happen from the senior gallery and felt, for the first time in many cycles, the specific cold sensation of a variable she had not modeled. The proctoring intelligence, faced with a scenario that no longer matched its parameters, did what intelligences do when reality diverges from the model. It graded the divergence as candidate error. Reyes received a failing mark for unauthorized interference with assessment equipment. The 5 Cassine candidates on his team received failing marks for inadequate crisis response, and the entire team was flagged for dismissal, which was precisely the outcome Corrin had designed, achieved through a different door. She signed the dismissal flag with the small satisfaction of a problem resolved. She did not yet understand that the human had not interfered with her assessment. He had repaired her building. The regulator he had shut down had not been part of the scenario. It had been failing for real, a genuine fault in a 40-cycle-old atmospheric bank that the maintenance lattice had logged twice, and the maintenance budget had deferred twice. If it had been allowed to sing its way to failure, it would have dumped the amphitheater's reserve atmosphere in under a minute, with 200 candidates inside. Reyes had not known it was real or simulated. He had heard the note, and he had done what the note demanded, the way a man pulls a child back from a ledge without first establishing whether the drop is genuine. This was the detail Tessuth could not let go of, and it was the detail that drove him, against every instinct of self-preservation a junior examiner possesses, to walk into the maintenance archive that night and pull the regulator bank service history. He found the 2 deferred fault logs. He found the bearing wear projection that gave the third regulator a 40% chance of catastrophic failure within the cycle. He found the maintenance order, signed by Corrin's office, that had reclassified the repair as non-urgent and rolled it forward. And he found, threaded through the budget reconciliation that justified the deferral, the first loose end of something much larger than a deferred repair, a pattern of reclassifications and deferrals and quiet relocations that traced back through 3 cycles and resolved, when he followed it far enough, into a set of contracts that had nothing to do with the maintenance of the conclave, and everything to do with who passed and who failed, and what their families would pay to change it. He sat in the archive for a long time with the data open in front of him. He was 26 cycles younger than Corrin, and a single rank below her and entirely without protection, and what he had found would end either her career or his, and the arithmetic of which one depended on factors he could not control. He did the only thing his curiosity would permit. He kept the file, and he went to find the human. Reyes had not been dismissed yet, because the dismissal protocol required the cycle's full sequence to complete before flags were executed, and so he was still in his alcove on the failure tier, sitting on the edge of his bunk, cleaning the contacts of his assessment band with the corner of his jacket when Tessuth arrived. The junior examiner stood in the doorway for a moment, uncertain how to begin, and Reyes looked up at him with the same mild attention he had given the inscription on the entrance arch. "You shut down a failing regulator," Tessuth said. "It was singing," Reyes said. "Bearing was gone. You hear it in the harmonic." He set the band down. "You came all the way down here to tell me I'm right about a fan?" "I came to ask why you failed 3 assessments you should have passed." Reyes was quiet for a moment. Then he asked Tessuth to sit, and when the examiner did, he told him, in the blunt, unvarnished way of a man stating facts that cost him nothing, about the salvage rigs of the Ophir Deep, where he had grown up, where his family had made their living, pulling dead ships out of the gravity wells of a system that had been abandoned by everyone who could afford to leave. The rig his father ran was called the Patient, a name the elder Reyes had chosen because, he said, the deep rewarded exactly one virtue, and it was not courage. Adam had worked the cutting teams from the age of 9, hanging in the dark on a tether 40 meters off the hull of a derelict, listening through his gloves to the groan of metal that had been dead for a century, and was still, in its slow way, deciding whether to let go of its last reserve of stored pressure. He had watched a man named Brackett die on his second cutting run, a loud, confident man who had cut into a bulkhead everyone could see was sound and had not heard the seam 2 meters over that everyone could not see, was not, and the patient had logged it as a structural release and gone back to work because the deep did not pause for the loud, and the deep did not pause for anyone. Adam had learned the harmonic of a failing seal the way other children learned a language, not as knowledge but as instinct. The low climbing note that meant a bearing had 4 hours left, and the higher singing note that meant it had 40 minutes, and he had learned that the worst thing a cutting team could carry was a member who trusted what he could see over what he could hear. He told him that on a salvage rig the worst thing a person could be was the one who knew everything and said so, because the one who knew everything and said so got everyone killed. Since the loud, certain mind stopped listening, and the deep was a place that punished people who stopped listening. He told him that his father had taught him a discipline that the rig crews called holding back, which meant that you never gave the deep your full attention until the deep had earned it, because attention was finite, and the deep was infinite, and a person who spent everything on the first problem had nothing left for the problem. The first one was hiding. The recall lattice, Reyes said, had wanted him to spend everything memorizing 400 precedents, and he had memorized the shape of them and held back the specifics, because the specifics were retrievable, and the shape was the only thing the precedents were actually trying to teach, and a diplomat who could quote 400 clauses and not see the structure beneath them was a diplomat who would lose every negotiation that mattered. The pressure negotiation had wanted him to spend everything fighting a machine that could not be beaten, and he had held back because the machine's entire power was that it fed on engagement, and a thing that feeds on engagement starves without it. And the crisis cascade, he said, had wanted him to spend everything on a fake reactor, and he had held back enough attention to hear the real fault in the floor, because the test in front of him was never the only test in the room. They graded you as a failure, Tessuth said. They graded what I gave them, Reyes said. I didn't give them much. He picked the band back up. Where I'm from, you don't show the deep everything you've got. You show it what gets the job done, and you keep the rest in reserve, because the moment it knows your ceiling is the moment it owns you. He looked at Tessuth then, with something that was not quite a smile. Your tests measure how much a person will pour out under pressure. They don't measure what a person chooses to hold back. That's the whole skill. That's the only skill that's ever kept anyone alive down there. Tessuth left the alcove that night with two things he had not had before: a complete map of Corin's corruption, and a complete understanding of what her assessment sequence had failed to measure. And he understood, with the particular dread of a person who has crossed a threshold they cannot uncross, that the two were the same problem. The conclave measured outpouring. Corin had built her entire quiet enterprise on the certainty that outpouring was measurable, and that a person's true caliber could be read from how much they spent. A mind that held back, that gave the system only the minimum and kept its real depth in reserve, was invisible to her instruments and unaccountable to her contracts. And a person like that was the single most dangerous thing that could enter her conclave, because they could not be priced, could not be predicted, and could not be made to reveal the ceiling that her entire scheme depended on, knowing. The fourth assessment was the final reckoning, and it was here that Corin made her error, because she had decided to make an example of the human. The final reckoning was the cycle's capstone, conducted before the full assembly of examiners and the visiting oversight council, and it was ordinarily reserved for the highest-scoring candidates, a public demonstration of excellence. Corin broke precedent and entered candidate 7144 into it. Her stated reason, logged for the council, was instructional, a demonstration of how a fundamentally unfit candidate fails under genuine scrutiny, a useful corrective to any council member inclined towards sentiment about borderline cases. Her real reason, which she logged nowhere, was that the human had disrupted her crisis cascade and produced an anomaly the proctoring intelligence could not cleanly grade, and an anomaly in the record was a thread, and Corin had survived 3 cycles by leaving no threads. She intended to put him in front of the full assembly, present him with a scenario engineered to expose the gaps in his deliberately partial performances, and grade him into a failure so total and so public that no oversight council would ever revisit his file. She would close the thread by burning it. The scenario she designed was a live diplomatic crisis, a border dispute between 2 simulated polities on the edge of war, with the candidate cast as the sole mediator and the full adaptive weight of the proctoring intelligence arrayed against any attempt to resolve it. She built in the same unwinnable architecture as the pressure negotiation, but scaled it across an entire war with 100 moving constructs and a clock, and she sealed the assessment chamber, and took her place in the senior gallery beside the oversight council, and prepared to watch the human pour himself out and come up empty in front of everyone who mattered. Tessuth sat 3 rows back with the file in his band and his hands very still. Reyes entered the chamber, took his seat at the mediator's table, and looked at the crisis arrayed before him in the air. The 2 polities, the 100 constructs, the clock counting down from 90 minutes. He did not begin negotiating. He sat, as he had sat in the pressure negotiation, with his hands folded, and he watched. The clock ran. 5 minutes passed, then 10, and the Oversight Council began to shift in their seats, and a council member leaned toward Corin and murmured something, and Corin murmured back the word patience, which was the word she had chosen to deploy, because it suggested she had foreseen the human stillness, and built her grade to account for it. She had not. She was watching the same stillness Tessuth was watching and reading it as the collapse she wanted, and the gap between her reading and the truth was the entire width of the trap she had walked into. 5 minutes passed, then 10, and Corin felt the first thread of satisfaction, because a candidate who did nothing was a candidate failing in the most legible way possible. But Tessuth, watching the human and not the clock, saw what Corin did not. Reyes was not doing nothing. He was listening to the crisis, the way he had listened to the floor of the amphitheater, head tilted, one finger tracing a slow line on the table, mapping the 100 constructs, not as 100 problem zones but as 100 outputs of something he had not yet located, and somewhere around the 15th minute his finger stopped. He had found the note. The crisis Corin had built was unwinnable by design, but it was not random. An adaptive intelligence arraying 100 constructs against a single mediator had to coordinate them, and coordination left a signature, a central process that fed the constructs their escalations and kept them aligned. And that central process, like every system, had a harmonic, a point of load, where the whole structure was carrying more than it was built to carry. The proctoring intelligence had been designed to overwhelm a candidate by attacking from 100 directions at once. It had not been designed for a candidate who ignored all 100 directions and listened instead for the single point from which the 100 were being driven. Reyes did not negotiate with the polities. He did not respond to the constructs. He reached into the crisis and addressed one parameter, a notional disputed water allocation that every construct's escalation tree depended on as its founding grievance. And he proposed a resolution to it so simple and so structurally complete that the central process, which had built its entire 100-front war on the assumption that the grievance was permanent, had no escalation queued for its disappearance. The crisis did not resolve. It collapsed. 100 constructs, their founding grievance removed, lost coherence in the same degraded null state the pressure negotiation construct had reached, all at once, and the chamber's display, which had been a roiling map of war, went still. The silence in the assembly lasted 4 seconds. Then the Oversight Council began, very quietly, to ask questions. Corin's first instinct, honed across 3 cycles, was to grade the collapse as an error, the same maneuver that had worked in the crisis cascade, and she opened her examiner's authority to enter the failing mark. But the final reckoning was conducted before the full assembly, and the proctoring intelligence's raw output was visible to the Oversight Council in real time, and the council had just watched a candidate the senior examiner had publicly declared fundamentally unfit reach into an unwinnable scenario and find, in 15 minutes of apparent inactivity, the single structural keystone that 9 cycles of high-scoring candidates had never found. A council member named Doraskel, the eldest present, asked Corin to explain the grade she was entering. Corin said that the candidate had not engaged the scenario as designed. Doraskel observed that the candidate had resolved the scenario, which was presumably the purpose of the design. Corin said that the resolution was not achieved through the assessed competencies. Doraskel asked which competency was being assessed, if not the resolution of crises, and Corin, for the first time in 12 cycles before the full assembly, did not have a clean answer ready. It was the opening Tessuth had been waiting for, and he was younger and lower and entirely without protection, and he stood up anyway. He did not give a speech. He had grown up in the same corps as Corin, and he knew that a speech before the assembly was a thing the assembly could dismiss as ambition, and so he did the one thing the assembly could not dismiss. He transmitted the file. He sent the maintenance logs, the deferred repairs, the bearing projection that had given the third regulator a 40% chance of killing 200 candidates, the budget reconciliations, the pattern of reclassifications across 3 cycles, and the contracts at the end of the thread, directly to the Oversight Council's shared lattice, and he sat back down, and he let the data do what data does when it is finally placed in front of people who are required to look at it. The assembly went very quiet. Corin sat in the senior gallery with her authority still open and the failing mark still unentered, and she understood, with the cold clarity she had always prided herself on, that the human she had entered into the final reckoning to close a thread had instead pulled, the one loose end that unraveled everything, and that he had done it without knowing the thread existed, simply by being the kind of mind her entire enterprise was built to be unable to see. The Oversight Council suspended the cycle's results within the hour and impounded the assessment records. Corrin's corruption did not collapse in a single dramatic scene, because corruption built across 3 cycles does not collapse that way. It was disassembled slowly over the following weeks by an oversight inquiry that followed Tessuth's thread through every reclassification and every contract and every family that had paid for a name. Corrin did not weep or rage or confess. She sat through the inquiry with the same precision she had brought to everything, and when it was finished, she was stripped of her rank and her record and returned to the lower tiers of the Corps, which was the same fate she had quietly inflicted on 3 cycles of candidates whose families had no standing, and there was a symmetry in it that no one in the assembly remarked upon aloud, but everyone understood. This resolution belonged to the inquiry, and it concluded in its own time, in rooms the human was never in. Adam Reyes was not in the assembly when his results were revised, because he had gone back to his alcove on the failure tier, and was, when Tessuth found him for the second time, asleep, having decided that the outcome of the inquiry was not a thing he could affect, and therefore not a thing worth spending attention on. Tessuth woke him to tell him that the council had voted, that the 3 deliberate failures had been reread in light of what the assessments had failed to measure, that the final reckoning collapse had been entered as the highest crisis resolution score in the conclave's recorded history, and that candidate 7144 had been marked fit for the diplomatic corps of the Cassine Reach. Reyes listened to all of it with the same mild attention, and at the end he asked whether the regulator had been repaired. Tessuth, who had not expected the question and did not have the answer, said he would find out. Reyes nodded and said that was the only result he had actually been waiting on, and went back to cleaning his band. The acceptance did not make him welcome. The Cassine candidates who had scored in the high 90s and earned their placements through a lifetime of training did not regard the human who had failed 3 tests and been elevated by an inquiry as a peer, and in the days that followed his elevation, they made the particular cold space around him that a unit makes around a member it has not yet decided to accept. Reyes did not appear to notice, or to mind, or to require their acceptance, which only deepened the cold space, because a unit's contempt is a kind of bid for engagement, and a man who declines the bid leaves the contempt with nowhere to go. He attended the corps orientation in his worn gray jacket among the pressed uniforms, sat at the edge of the briefing hall and held back the way he had held back his entire life, giving the new system the minimum it required and keeping the rest in reserve until the system earned more. The thaw, when it came from the seismic tracker. Among the placed candidates was a Cassine named Orsevel, the largest of them, a heavy-bone specialist whose core designation was structural acoustic, and who read the world, as his subspecies had evolved to read it, through vibration carried in the bones of his skull. Orsevel had scored second in the cycle and had made no secret of his estimation of the human, which was that the elevation was a political correction, and not a measure of merit, and that a man who could not hold a negotiation for 5 minutes had no business in the corps. He said as much in the briefing hall on the 4th day, and Reyes did not respond to it, which Orsevel took for the silence of a man who had no answer. The next morning, in the lower corridors where the corps quartered, Orsevel woke to find that the structural acoustic resonance that had kept him from sleeping properly for 3 nights, a low harmonic in the quartering deck that no one else could feel, and that he had not mentioned to anyone because mentioning a sensitivity was a weakness, had stopped. For 3 nights he had lain in the dark with the harmonic, crawling up through the frame of his bunk into the bones of his jaw, a frequency low enough that it registered not as sound but as a wrongness, the deck itself unsettled, and he had told no one, because a structural acoustic specialist who admitted that a deck kept him awake was a specialist whose instrument was suspect. On the 4th morning the wrongness was simply gone, and the absence of it was so complete that he woke disoriented, reaching for a discomfort that had become familiar. He went looking for the cause and found, in the maintenance crawl beneath the deck, a bracket that had been shimmed and reseated, the loose mounting that had been feeding the harmonic into the deck plates, now packed tight with a folded strip cut from the corner of a worn gray field jacket. No one had told the human about the harmonic. Orsevel had told no one, but the human had grown up reading the bones of failing ships, and he had felt the deck singing the same way he had felt the amphitheater floor, and he had heard, beneath the harmonic, a Cassine 3 corridors over not sleeping, and he had fixed it in the night without being asked and without leaving his name. because where he was from you did not announce a repair. You simply made the structure sound again. Orsevel stood in the crawlspace for a long time holding the strip of gray cloth. Then he climbed out, and at the next briefing he sat down not at the far end of the hall, but at the edge of the humans' row, 1 seat away, and said nothing, and that was the entire transaction, and it was enough. Tessuth observed the shift from the examiner's gallery, where he now held Corin's former post, and recorded it in no file because some results were not the kind that belonged in a record. He had learned, across this single cycle, the thing the conclave had measured wrongly for 40 years, which was that the deepest competence does not announce itself, that the truest measure of a mind is not how much it pours out under pressure, but how much it has the discipline to hold in reserve, and that a system which only knows how to grade outpouring will always, inevitably, discard the one person it most needs. He thought about Corin, in the lower tiers now, who had built an entire enterprise on the certainty that everything important could be measured by what it gave. And he thought about the human who had given the conclave almost nothing, and in the nothing had revealed everything, and had then gone quietly to sleep while his own fate was decided 3 floors away. The Corps deployed on a 6-month rotation, and on the morning of the first deployment, the placed candidates assembled in the launch corridor in formation, and the formation had a structure, a precise geometry of rank and specialty that the Cassine had used for 1,000 years, and there was a position in it for the human, near the rear, the position the Corps assigned to a member it tolerated but did not yet trust. Reyes walked to the launch corridor in his gray jacket, with the corner cut from one elbow, and found that the position assigned to him was not at the rear. Orsevel had moved. The seismic tracker, the largest of them, the one who read the world through the bones of his skull, had shifted 1 place to the left in the formation and opened the position beside him, the flank position, the place where a unit puts the member whose senses it has come to rely on, and he stood there with his heavy shoulders square and his faceted eyes forward and did not look at the human at all, which was the entire point, because looking would have made it a gift, and not looking made it simply where the human now stood. Reyes took the position. He folded his hands behind his back and faced forward into the corridor, and the formation closed around him the way a structure closes around a part it has decided to carry, and somewhere in the bones of the deck, a harmonic that had been singing for 40 years was for the first time completely silent.